as you may recall, some 10 years ago, the United States announced that it was pivoting to Asia. This was called the so-called pivot to Asia. But that was meant basically pivoting from the Middle East, which had been the main focus, the main concern of U.S. foreign policy for a decade or so, to East Asia, mostly on China. Well, there is a saying, nature abhors a vacuum. China has stepped into that vacuum. Others can pivot as well. And the net result is what we are seeing with this agreement, brokered in Beijing, with a remarkable photo opportunity of Wang Yi and the representatives of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yes, I think that is absolutely true. Saudi Arabia realizes that, in many ways, sort of if not the days, at least the years of oil as the main source of energy in the world are, getting scarcer. And therefore, it has to do something to diversify its economy. China, which is the biggest manufacturing power in the world and the biggest trader, obviously can play a role in developing Saudi infrastructure. It can play a role in developing Saudi connectivity. It also can help in building Saudi's industrial capacity. So I think that is very much in the cards. Well, I will say this. I mean, the break of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran happened 7 years ago. It happened in 2016. The way things work is that this happened under China's watch. The deal was finalized in Beijing. It was announced in Beijing. And I understand the negotiations got underway, obviously, before, but got a significant push in recent months in Beijing, particularly after the visit of the president of Iran. Well, I will say this. It seems to me that the fact that there is a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran is good for everybody. It's good for all countries in West Asia, including Israel, and I think it is also good for the United States. The notion that somehow countries being at loggerheads with each other is a good thing, it seems quite mistaken. So that's the first point that it seems to me is important to keep in mind. Now, you could argue that this is not good news for the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu has made it his business and his sort of primary foreign policy objective to isolate Iran. Now, obviously, that is not working very well. For him, I would argue it is a setback. But otherwise, I think for the rest of West Asia and for the rest of the world, this is good news. I think rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. These are two countries with which India does a lot of business, which it works well. And therefore, I would argue very strongly that this is also good news for India. Brokering peace is not a zero-sum game. I think the fact that, one country manages to broker this rapprochement should be seen as a positive news for everybody, including India. So I think this is good news for India as well. Of course, well, I spoke on that at the conference at the IIC in a couple of weeks ago in Delhi. And that is the following. Yes, Latin American countries have been pressured to not just to side with Ukraine, they've also been pressured to provide arms to Ukraine in the current war with Russia. They have refused to do so, and to my mind, rightly so. This is a European war that should be solved and should be addressed by Europeans. it seems to me that this is not something that countries either in Latin America, in Africa, or in Asia should get involved in. It's a matter for Europeans to resolve. Russia was wrong to invade Ukraine, and many countries around the world have quite rightly condemned this. The notion that there should become a global war in which all 200 countries in the world should take part, siding with NATO and with the G7, is quite wrong-headed. And that is why, in a recent book that has just come out in London by Anthem Press, we argue for what we call active non-alignment, taking a page from India's tradition in foreign policy and taking, in that sense, a neutral stance in the war in Ukraine. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is a very complex one. We saw what has happened in the recent past in terms of oil production on the part of Saudi Arabia, in which requests by the United States were not heeded, despite the visit by President Biden, which was largely intended to achieve that. So it seems to me that Saudi Arabia is moving away from the very close relationship it had for a long time with the United States. It's looking to diversify its ties, including the ties with China. There are two things here to keep in mind. One of them, there are the differences between, the Sunni variant of Islam that we see in Saudi Arabia and the Shia variant of Islam that we see in Iran. And, traditionally there have been tensions between the two. So that is one element. But I would also argue there are some serious geopolitical concerns. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran are significant powers in the, in West Asia, and there is a natural element of competition between the two. Now, in the very, troubled international scenario that we are seeing right now, it seems to me that both Riyadh and Tehran have come to the conclusion that this is one, piece of trouble they do not need, and that they better, make amends and work together. There's enough trouble in the world as it is, without adding this one in particular. So I think they have concluded that the best thing is to move forward, leave the differences behind, and have a working relationship. Now, this does not mean that they will become best friends, they become some sort of military allies. They will not. But at least they will be able to have a working relationship, which is what diplomatic relations in the end are all about. They have both committed to open embassies in their respective capitals in the next few months, which again, I think is a positive thing.